She called me from a payphone outside a Tim Hortons in Sudbury at 2 in the morning, and I knew before she said a word that something had broken that couldn't be put back together easily. My daughter. My only child. The one who used to fall asleep on my chest watching hockey night in Canada when she was 4 years old. She was crying in that particular way people cry when they've been crying for so long they've gone quiet about it. Just breath and pauses, and the occasional sound that didn't quite make it all the way out. "Dad," she said, "I don't know what to do anymore." I was 63 years old and recovering from a hip replacement at my place in Timmins when that call came. My sister had been staying with me for 2 weeks, helping me get around, making sure I didn't fall in the bathroom, driving me to physio 3 times a week at the Porcupine Health Unit. My world had gotten very small. Walker to couch, couch to bed, bed to bathroom, repeat. I'd been retired from 31 years at the paper mill for 2 years, and I'll be honest. Retirement hadn't been kind to me. I missed the noise of it, the routine. After my wife passed in 2019, the house in Timmins felt like a museum I was being paid to guard, but that phone call at 2 in the morning cracked something open inside me. Something I thought the hip surgery and the grief and the years had sealed shut for good. Before I tell you the rest, I want to ask, where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who's out there with me tonight. My daughter's name is Rowan. She's 34. She took her mother's red hair and her grandmother's stubbornness and somehow ended up in Barrie, 350 kilometers south of me, married to a man named Curtis Holt. They'd met at a mutual friend's wedding in Huntsville. He seemed decent enough at the time. He worked in equipment leasing. He had good handshake and remembered people's names. I should have paid closer attention to what he remembered and what he chose to forget. Rowan had a daughter from a previous relationship. My granddaughter, Piper, 6 years old at the time of that phone call. Gap-toothed smile, obsessed with dinosaurs. The kind of kid who corrects adults when they get the species wrong. That's not a brontosaurus, Grandpa. That's a brachiosaurus. They're different. I adored that little girl the way you only adore the people who don't know yet that the world can disappoint them. Curtis had 2 sisters, Nadine, the older one, and a younger one named Blythe. Their mother, Gwendolyn Holt, was a piece of work I will describe to you in a moment. She lived 40 minutes from Barrie in a house she referred to as the family property, as though it were an estate in the English countryside rather than a 3-bedroom bungalow in Innisfil that smelled like cigarettes and Febreze. The short version of what Rowan told me that night on the payphone was this. Curtis had been hitting her. It had started small, the way these things apparently do, a shove after an argument, a grab that left bruises on her upper arm. Then, 3 months before that call, he'd pushed her down the back stairs during a fight about money and she'd cracked 2 ribs. She told the emergency room at RVH that she'd slipped on ice coming in from the garage. It was March. It was plausible. The nurse looked at her for a long moment and wrote it down. And then, 2 nights before she called me, Curtis had screamed at Piper for spilling juice on his work bag. When Rowan stepped between them, he'd backhanded her across the face hard enough that she hit the kitchen counter. Piper saw it. That was the thing that finally broke Rowan open enough to make the call. "She saw it, Dad," she kept saying. "She was right there." I sat on the edge of my bed in Timmins with the lamp on and the walker in front of me, and I felt something happen in my chest that I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't just anger. Anger is loud and hot. This was quiet and cold, and it went very deep, the way cold goes deep in northern Ontario in February, into the ground itself, into the rock underneath. "I'm coming down," I said. "Dad, your hip." "I'll manage my hip. Curtis will Rowan." I stopped her. "I'm coming down." My sister drove me to the bus station at 6 in the morning. She wanted to drive me all the way to Barrie, but I told her no. I needed to do this part alone. I don't know why exactly. Maybe because what I was planning required a certain kind of solitude to finalize. 4 hours on the Ontario Northland bus with a walker and a thermos of coffee, and a plan forming in the back of my mind like ice on a lake. Quiet, methodical, covering everything. Here's what I had going for me. I am 63 years old, and I walk with a slight limp from the surgery, and I have a beard that went fully white sometime around 2021, and I look, if I'm being honest, exactly like what people picture when they think of the word grandfather. Harmless, slow, a little forgetful, maybe. The kind of man you don't worry about. I have spent my entire adult life finding that underestimation useful. Rowan met me at the Barrie Transit Terminal on Maple Avenue. She was wearing sunglasses even though it was overcast. She hugged me and I could feel her flinch when my hand touched her back, and that told me everything about where the ribs still were in the healing process. We drove to her place on Essa Road in silence mostly. She'd sent Curtis to his mother's place in Innisfil under the pretense that she needed space after the fight, and Gwendolyn had apparently welcomed him with open arms and a narrative about how Rowan was difficult and ungrateful. Piper was at school. We had a window. The house was a semi-detached with a small yard, the kind of place that could have been cheerful but wasn't. I noticed it the same way you notice a song being played in the wrong key. Nothing you could point to directly, just an offness in everything. Curtains closed in the afternoon. A child's drawing of a house with a sun above it, taped to the fridge with no other drawings around it, isolated, like it had been put there for appearances. A coffee mug in the cabinet turned so the handle faced the wall. Rowan made tea and we sat at the kitchen table and she told me everything in the order it had actually happened, rather than the order she'd been telling herself had happened, which is a different thing entirely. 2 hours later I called Curtis. "I'm here," I said, "at Rowan's. Came down to help her out for a bit with the hip recovery. Getting harder to manage on my own up north. Hope that's all right." There was a pause, then, "Of course, Harold, it's your daughter's house. Good to have you." His voice was perfectly pleasant. That pleasantness was a kind of mask, and we both knew it, but we were going to proceed as though we didn't know it, because that's how these things work in the early stages. He came home that evening. He shook my hand. He called me Harold. He helped carry my bag to the guest room even though I hadn't asked him to, which was the first move in establishing that he was in charge of the geography of the house. I thanked him warmly and let him believe it was working. Piper came home from school at 4 and launched herself at me the way 6-year-olds do when they haven't seen someone they love. We spent 20 minutes on the floor with her dinosaur figures before Curtis suggested, gently, that she give Grandpa some space to rest. The suggestion was framed as concern for me. It was actually concern about the quality of my observation. I rested. I observed. Over the next 3 days, I watched the household operate. Curtis was surface pleasant when I was visible, and something else entirely in the moments he thought I was out of earshot. I am 63 and I walk slowly, and this means people forget I'm still in the hallway. He spoke to Rowan in a particular register, not shouting, not obviously threatening, but with a consistent low-grade contempt that was like water damage. Invisible until it had already done structural harm. "You forgot the dry cleaning again." Not a question, a pronouncement. Piper's lunch yesterday had no protein. I've told you about that. As though Rowan were an employee whose performance reviews were never going to improve. Piper moved differently around Curtis than she moved around me. With me she was all elbows and opinions. With him she got smaller. Not afraid exactly, she'd learned to read him well enough to stay in the safe zones but compressed. Like a kid who'd figured out that the best way to avoid something was to become temporarily invisible. On the second day, Gwendolyn arrived. She knocked twice and then came in without waiting, which I suspected was standard operating procedure. She was a tall woman in her mid-60s, the kind of woman who wore seasonal decorative jewelry and had opinions about how other people loaded dishwashers. She surveyed the kitchen the way a building inspector surveys a property she already knows she's going to fail. "Harold," she said to me, "Rowan mentioned you'd be staying." Her tone suggested this was one more item on a list of disappointments she had chosen to endure with grace. "Good to meet you," I said, and I smiled the way I'd been smiling for 3 days, warm, slightly vague, an old man grateful for hospitality. Blythe came with her. Blythe was 31 and had inherited her mother's cataloging gaze and applied it specifically to Rowan, looking for failures of housekeeping. Failures of grooming, failures of general adequacy. She made a comment about a water stain on the ceiling in the hallway that Rowan had mentioned to Curtis 6 months ago and that he had done nothing about. Piper came home from school, and Gwendolyn pulled her into a hug that lasted slightly too long and involved a running commentary about how thin she was getting and whether Rowan was feeding her enough iron. "She looks pale," Gwendolyn said to Blythe in a voice calibrated to be just barely audible to Rowan. Rowan stood at the kitchen counter and said nothing. I refilled my tea and said nothing. That evening, after Gwendolyn and Blythe had gone and Piper was in bed, Curtis poured himself a scotch and sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked me about the mill. We talked for 40 minutes about shift work and retirement and the way Northern Ontario winters get into your joints. He was good company when he wanted to be. That was the most frightening thing about him, the ease of it. "I want Rowan to be happy," he said at one point. "She just makes it hard sometimes. You know how she can be." I nodded slowly, like a man who knew how she could be. He took that as the alliance he'd been building toward. That was a mistake. On the 4th day I found what I needed. I wasn't snooping. Or I was, but only because Rowan had told me where to look. In the filing cabinet in the spare room, 3rd drawer, behind the Scotiabank folders, there was a manila envelope. Inside it were 7 years of financial records. Curtis handled all of it. The joint account, the mortgage, the receipt he'd opened for Piper that Rowan had never been given the login credentials for. There were also credit card statements in Rowan's name that she hadn't known existed. $43,000. Opened in her name, run up in her name, the debt sitting there like a slow-burning fire she didn't know was in the walls of her own house. I photographed everything with my phone. Then I called a lawyer, a woman I'd been connected to through a friend of a friend, a family law specialist in Barrie on Dunlop Street. I didn't make an appointment for myself. I made it for Rowan. Then I called a contact at Service Canada about the financial abuse documentation process. Then I sat down and wrote out, longhand on a yellow notepad, the complete picture of what I was looking at. Rowan sat across from me and read it. It took her a long time. When she finished, she was very still for a moment. "I knew about some of this," she said. "I know. Not all of it. No, he opened a credit card in my name." Yes, she put the paper down and looked out the window at the backyard where Piper's slide was rusting slightly at the seams. "Okay," she said finally. "What do we do?" Here's where I want to be careful, because this is the part of the story I am not proud of, and also the part that worked. I had a plan. I want to be honest that it involved some deception, and that I am not recommending deception as a general policy, but I want you to understand why I made the choices I made. Curtis had told his mother that Rowan was unstable. He'd been seeding that narrative for years, little comments to family, to mutual friends, to his colleagues. He'd laid the groundwork carefully. If Rowan tried to leave, the story was already written. She was erratic, he'd been patient, she'd made false allegations. He'd done the same thing to his first girlfriend, 7 years before Rowan. I found that out too, through the lawyer. I needed evidence that couldn't be explained away, reframed, or disputed. I needed him to say clearly in his own words what he believed he was entitled to do. I started by letting him win. For 2 days I was, in Curtis's presence, more confused than I actually was. I repeated myself. I asked the same questions twice. I left my reading glasses in the wrong room and had to be helped to find them. I took longer to stand up than I needed to. Curtis helped me graciously. He liked helping me. It confirmed the geography. On the 6th night, I told him at dinner that I was worried about Rowan, that she seemed unhappy, that I wondered if I'd done something wrong as a father. I made my voice uncertain, a little lost, the way voices actually get when people are genuinely afraid they've failed their children. Curtis relaxed. This was the conversation he'd been waiting for. "She struggles with perspective," he said carefully. "She builds things up in her mind. I've talked to her doctor about it, actually. There's anxiety there, real anxiety, that she doesn't manage well." He had not talked to her doctor. I knew this because Rowan had told me, and because I had independently confirmed it. But I nodded slowly, like a man receiving difficult information about his daughter. "Has she said things to you?" he asked. "About me? She said you two have been fighting," I said. "She said she's been clumsy lately. Keeps hurting herself. That's the anxiety," he said, and his voice had the precise cadence of someone who has said a practiced thing so many times it has started to feel like truth. "She gets overwhelmed and she's not careful. I've tried to get her help, but she refuses. She showed me her ribs," I said quietly, still in the voice of a confused old man, "when she was helping me with my brace. A fraction of a second of stillness, then, staircase, in March. She was carrying laundry and I'd told her to be careful on those stairs 100 times. "Right," I said. "Right." She mentioned the stairs. He poured more scotch. "Harold, I want to be straight with you, man to man. Rowan needs more support than I can give her on my own. I think a period of residential care, maybe. Somewhere she can really get the help she needs. I've been looking into it. There are good facilities." There it was. My phone was in my shirt pocket. I'd pressed record 11 minutes earlier when I'd gotten up to put my cup in the sink. "Residential care," I said. "What kind?" he told me. He explained it in the careful language of concern, but what he was describing was removing Rowan from her home, from Piper, from any witness to what he did, and establishing a paper trail that would let him frame every allegation she ever made as a symptom. I let him finish. "That's a lot to think about," I said. "I know it's hard to hear. I appreciate you being honest with me." He put his hand on my shoulder, the hand of a man who has decided he has an ally. I pressed stop. The next morning I called Rowan's lawyer. The next afternoon, Rowan filed for an emergency protection order at the Barry Courthouse on Worsley Street. She had the medical records. She had the financial records. She had a recorded conversation that the lawyer described, carefully, as highly useful. She had 7 years of a pattern documented clearly enough that the duty judge granted the order the same day. Curtis came home that evening to find 2 Barry police officers waiting in the driveway and a locksmith finishing up at the front door. I was sitting on the front step with my walker and my thermos when his car pulled up. He saw me. He understood, in that moment, exactly what had happened and exactly how it had happened. I watched it move across his face, the confusion first, then the calculation, then the thing underneath the calculation that I recognized from 31 years of watching men face situations they couldn't manage or charm their way out of. He tried to speak to me, but the officers redirected him. He was served the protection order. He was told that his access to the property was suspended pending the hearing. He was informed that the financial investigation already initiated by Service Canada, I'd made that call 4 days earlier, would be proceeding regardless of any civil proceedings. Gwendolyn arrived 20 minutes later, having clearly been called. She got out of her car and looked at the house and looked at me and said, with the precision of a woman who has never once admitted to being wrong about anything, "You had no right." My daughter had 2 broken ribs and a credit card in her name with $43,000 she didn't know about, I said. Gwendolyn's mouth did something complicated. Curtis is a good man who... I have a recording of Curtis explaining his plan to have my daughter committed to a psychiatric facility so he could retain custody of a child he hasn't legally adopted, I said. I'd save the good man argument for somewhere it has a better chance. She got back in her car. Blythe, who had arrived with her and had been standing slightly behind her through this entire exchange, looked at me for a long moment before she followed. I won't tell you Blythe said anything. She didn't. But there was something in her face that wasn't entirely the same as her mother's. And I've thought about that look more than once in the months since. The hearing happened 6 weeks later. By then, the financial investigation had confirmed the fraudulent credit accounts. By then, Rowan had moved into a rental on Bayfield Street with Piper and a cat named Brigadier that Piper had named herself. By then, the RSP, Piper's education savings, had been frozen pending the divorce proceedings and would ultimately be transferred into Rowan's sole control. Curtis retained a lawyer and made the case he'd been building for years. Unstable, anxious, poor judgment. The lawyer was good. But a recording is a recording, and medical records are medical records. And $43,000 in fraudulent debt is $43,000 in fraudulent debt. And these things have a way of speaking clearly when they're laid out in a courtroom without anyone to reframe them. The divorce was finalized 8 months after Rowan made that call from the payphone outside Tim Hortons. She got the house eventually. They sold it, and she got her share, which was enough for a proper down payment on the place on Bayfield she'd been renting. Piper started grade 2 in September, and her teacher sent Rowan a note in October saying she seemed like a different kid, so much more herself this year. I read that, and I had to put it down for a minute. I've thought a lot about what I did and whether it was right. I was not a perfect actor in this story. I deceived a man to get a recording of him being honest, and there is something philosophically uncomfortable about that which I won't pretend away. I also know that Rowan had been trying to tell the truth, directly and clearly, for 7 years, and the truth had not been enough without evidence attached to it. I am 63 years old, and I spent 31 years doing a job that required me to watch for things that were about to go wrong before they went wrong. That instinct doesn't retire when you do. It just waits. Piper asked me on the last Sunday of that summer why I'd come to stay with them for so long. We were in the backyard. She was excavating the garden for what she described as probably fossils, maybe bones. I wanted to help your mom, I said. She considered this. Were you scared? A little. But you came anyway. That's what you do, I said, when it's someone you love. She went back to digging. After a moment, she held up a small pale stone and examined it with the focus of a professional. Grandpa, she said. Yeah, I'm glad you answered the phone. Me too, sweetheart, me too. If this story made you think about someone in your life who might need a phone call answered tonight, make it. Don't wait for the 2 a.m. moment. The signs are always there earlier. Be the person who notices them. And tell me in the comments, when was the last time someone showed up for you when you needed it most?